Welcome to the Most Days Show. The mission of Most Days is to measurably increase quality of life globally by helping people change their habits. This show is devoted to understanding how change happens. Today, we speak with Dr. Robert Sapolsky about human behavior and free will. Robert holds the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professorship at Stanford University with joint appointments in biological sciences, neurology and neurological sciences, and neurosurgery. He's written multiple books. His best-known book, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, was a New York Times bestseller, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and one of the Washington Post's 10 best books of the year. His most recent book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, was published in October and is available now. There is perhaps no better guest to help us think about human behavior and free will. Hope you enjoy. Robert Sapolsky, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So I'm a big fan of your work, and I've been hoping to have you on the podcast for some time now. So thrilled to have you. You wrote, you've got a couple of, you've got more than a couple of amazing books. I think we'll primarily talk about Behave and Determined today, but you wrote the seminal book, at least in my opinion, on behavior, aptly titled Behave. So you might just be the perfect guest for the conversations that we have here. So I'm excited to talk about human behavior and what we can learn from your work that might help us in our own journeys of finding a path to behavior that helps us, lead lives that feel good and that we're excited about. But before we do that, can you give us just your potted bio, a quick sense of you?
Well, let's see. I'm a professor of biology, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford University. I'm also a research associate at the Institute for Primate Research in Kenya in East Africa. And I don't know, I've been thinking about brains and hormones and primates and behavior for many decades now.
And what got you into the work in the first place? Like, why were you first interested in, because you started studying this at a young age. What was the impetus?
Oh, I was about 8 when I decided I wanted to be a field primatologist, study primates out in the wild. As far as I can tell, it was, my mother taking me to the Museum of Natural History in New York for the first time. And in retrospect, like if we had walked into like the exhibit on horseshoe crabs or something, I would have imprinted on them. But as it happened, we went into the primate hall. And I decided I wanted to live in one of those dioramas there and decided I was going to be a primatologist and made plans for that. In college, I went and studied at the feet of like one of the gods of baboon field research and all of that. But along the way, that during those 4 years, also got interested in neuroscience and sort of the neurobiological basis of behavior, as opposed to out in the field, evolutionary, ecological basis of it. And somehow I've managed to be oscillating back and forth for decades between being a lab neurobiologist and a field primatologist studying baboons out in a national park in East Africa.
Well, your work is excellent, and it's fascinating work. You don't believe in free will, and we'll get to that. And so you don't believe that you deserve credit for your work. So I'm wondering how we might commend you. So let me try. Congratulations on the genetic, environmental, and neurochemical ripple effect that started at the Big Bang and culminated in your years of research that you had no choice in achieving.
Sure, that sounds about right. I don't know what should be congratulated there, but nonetheless, yeah, that's kind of beginning to get at how I think about the roots of behavior.
Well, I'm excited to get there. So I want to start maybe with drawing on your baboon experience. And so many of the conversations we have with people like you on this podcast, they boil down to really this mismatch between the bodies and minds that we inhabit and the environment that we live in. And, the analogy that I would use is it's almost like we're in a zoo and we need to be really proactive at recreating some of the factors of the natural environment in order to stay healthy. And for so many of us, that's really difficult. and we're not healthy. So we've got epidemics and, diabetes and obesities, et cetera. Or we're like doing the work. It's like, okay, I'm going to exercise and eat whole foods. And we're doing a bunch of things that would happen just automatically in a more natural environment. And so what can we learn from the baboons, the way in which they live, and the way in which it's maybe different from the way that we live, or the way in which it's the same? Like, can we understand a little bit of ourselves in this mismatch by knowing more, by sitting and staring at baboons for 10 hours a day for a few months for 30 years?
Well, that's what I kept telling the people who paid for the rice and beans I would have out there. But I'm glad you're emphasizing the mismatch, because that's really at the core of what I've thought about. What I have focused on most over the years is stress, the ability of stress hormones to damage the brain, trying to get a sense of who gets stress-related diseases, who shows more resilience. And that entire field is about that mismatch. Because go back 100 million years and some dinosaur is getting stressed because another one is trying to eat it, and it's secreting the exact same stress hormone, the same molecule as we do in a traffic jam. We're thinking about global warming, we're thinking about mortality or something. And the key thing you see is when that hormone is mobilized because you're running for your life, it and some of the other hormones involved, everything they're doing is saving your life. It's sending energy to your thigh muscles. It's making your heart beat faster. It's turning off silly stuff like growth and tissue repair and reproduction, like do it tonight if there is a tonight. And that makes perfect sense. But what do? We sit and we worry, for 30 days each month about like how we're going to pay the rent at the end. And we're secreting the same hormones and making the same changes in our body, and run for your life and your blood pressure goes through the roof. That's good. That's saving your life. Do the same thing when you're thinking about psychological stressors, and do it chronically and you're going to get sick. So that's the basic mismatch that we have. As a species, we're smart enough to psychologically stress ourselves chronically, and that's not what the system evolved for. And that's why we get all sorts of stress-related diseases. And it turns out baboons are perfect for studying this, because you take baboons and like what I wanted to understand about them was, what does your social rank have to do with how well your body deals with stress? What is your personality? All of that. So baboons, they're living out in the grasslands of East Africa. They live in these big troops, 50 to 100 animals or so. And their lifestyle is actually great. They are big enough and aggressive enough that the predators don't mess with them much. Their infant survival rate is better than among the surrounding humans. Most of all, they only have to work about 3 hours a day to get their food, foraging. And what that means is they've got 9 hours of free time every day to devote to making each other miserable with social maneuvering and pettiness and backstabbing and forming a coalition and then bailing out on your partner. And they're just like us. They've got the luxury ecologically that they could spend most of their days generating psychological stress for each other. They're perfect models for westernized stress. If you have a baboon who is miserable, it's because some other baboon has worked long and hard to make that happen. So they're great models for that mismatch and looking at chronic psychosocial stress and what it does to the body.
And what are they not struggling with? Like, so I assume we're not seeing obesity in the baboons. I would assume we're not seeing the same rates of diabetes. Are we seeing, symptoms of things like anxiety and depression? Like, what are we suffering from that is unique to the modern environment we're living in, that is different from what the baboons suffer from because they're in a more natural environment?
Well, exactly the stuff you point out, because of their diet, which is like mostly nuts and seeds and stuff like that. And if they're lucky, every now and then they kill a gazelle or something. No diabetes. I've actually studied their cholesterol levels and their HDL cholesterol, and they make a ultra marathoner look like a couch potato kind of thing. So they're in great shape in that regard. But what do they show? Absolute baboon equivalents of anxiety and depression. What does anxiety look like in a baboon? You're a low-ranking baboon, and there are our model systems for baboon anxiety. You're out there by yourself. You're on the edge of the troop. Everybody's looking elsewhere, and you spot like a rabbit or something, and you grab it and kill it, and this is great, and you're about to eat it. And what are you being anxious about at this point? Somebody higher ranking is going to spot you with this, come over, thrash you over and steal the food from you. But you're sitting there and nobody's looking. So you sit there, you, the observer, and you watch the baboon, and how many seconds go by before he's got to stop and look over his shoulder? Who's coming to take it from me? Goes back to like dismembering this meal. Stop, look over your shoulder, look again, stop again. And finally, because it seems so inevitable, somebody's going to show up and take it from you. Give up, stand up, and that's, you've given up on it. The sitting there looking over your shoulder over and over and over is the equivalent of anxiety. You're seeing threats that other people don't. You're having trouble detecting safety signals. And the more that baboon is stopping to look over its shoulder, the more of an index of anxiety it is. And some of the stuff that I've seen is the chemistry going on in their bodies is exactly the same as in humans with anxiety disorders. But then you push them long enough that you get the baboon from a mindset of, yeah, I'm going to eat this rabbit, but I better stop right now and look to see who's coming to pummel me. Well, you get to a state of mind where you say, this is hopeless. I'm helpless. Why am I even bothering? That's when you got a baboon model of what depression is, learned helplessness. And a lot of the work that I've done is showing on a nuts and bolts level what's going on in the brains and pituitaries of these guys, low-ranking baboons, is very similar to what you see in humans with major depression, a picture of having learned to be helpless and hopeless.
And do you think maybe we've got it wrong? Because I think when we talk about at least the holistic changes that somebody might make if they're suffering from anxiety or depression, those don't typically have to do with social status, right? It's like, hey, let's make sure we're sleeping well. Let's make sure we're exercising. Let's make sure we're eating well. There's some recommendation around mindfulness. Do you think maybe we're missing the mark on the importance of social status in that conversation? Should we be talking about like, what neighborhood do you live in? And like, do you have the big house on the block or the small house on the block, or who might be taking your job, or whatever the equivalent is for human? Are we under rotating on social status as it relates to these, or it's a different thing for us?
I think it's absolutely part of the picture, and it's intertwined with the picture you just talked about. Okay, social status, socioeconomic status in humans. What are the price you pay if you're a baboon? You don't get the good spot in the shade when it's hot. Somebody takes the food away from you. Poverty here, socioeconomic status being low on the ladder, one of the things it translates into is really crappy health. And what people have been studying forever is the, quote, socioeconomic health gradient. As you go down the ladder, every step down in SES that you get in people is associated with worse health in every type of disease you could imagine, greater likelihood of getting it, more likely to be killed by it, shorter life expectancy. And what people have been trying to figure out for years is, why is poverty, why is socioeconomic status, why does social status in humans get underneath your skin and gets translated into how well your body is doing? And the obvious explanation doesn't work. Oh, poor people can't afford to go to the doctor. That's why they have lousy health. And you look in countries with socialized medicine and universal health care, and there's an SES gradient there as well. Not as steep as in the good old United States without any health and sort of safety nets, but it's not access to doctors. Oh, I get it. If you're poor, you're living next door to a toxic waste dump, or you can't afford to get a health club membership, or take 6 months off from work to sit and learn to play the guitar and contemplate your navel. More risk factors, fewer protective factors. You look at that, and that accounts for only about a third of the difference. What it's about is stress. And here's where it comes in. A whole bunch of findings showing it's not so much being poor that's bad for your health, it's feeling poor. and all sorts of questionnaires and stuff that get at somebody's subjective sense of socioeconomic status, and your subjective read of it is as predictive of the poor health as is your objective. What is that? It's not being poor that's bad for your health, it's feeling poor. And what the studies then show is what's the greatest, most effective way to make somebody feel poor? Surround them with all the people doing better than them. Inequality. And what you see is it's not poverty per se that's a predictor of poor health outcomes. It's relative poverty amid plenty. It's not being poor, it's feeling poor. And the surest way to feel poor is having your nose rubbed in it all the time by seeing what you're not getting. And that's the key predictor of where the bad health outcomes are coming from. And what do you see with that? That's a world in which, like social inequality, destroys social support and having social peers because the hierarchy is so steep. You're not getting social support. You're not getting outlets for frustration. You're working 3 jobs to get by. So like you're barely seeing your family, all these versions of that. And people smoke more and drink more and eat to excess and all those bad health habits that are stress reducing in a really toxic kind of way. And you see a linkage there. You can't make sense of somebody's body and brain and health outside the context of sort of the psychology of that person. And you can't make sense of the psychology of that person outside the context of the society in which they're living.
If you want to be proactive in changing your behavior to improve the quality of your life, I hope you'll join us on Most Days. Most Days, currently available on iOS and soon on Android, is a fully digital system that uses behavioral psychology to help you change your behavior and habits to improve the quality of your life. We have a flexible contribution system through which you can support us at the level that makes sense for you. Hope to see you there. Yeah, it reminds me, I mean, it's maybe a little bit of an epiphany for me, but, quality of life has been, on average, it's been increasing pretty steadily for a few hundred years, but we now have introduced this exposure via social media to the way that other people are living. And it just strikes me that that's really important here because the perception of having less or being less is actually more important than the reality, and being exposed to people with so much more makes it so much easier to feel bad about myself. Like I'll feel pretty good about the work that I'm doing. Then I get on Twitter and I'm like, oh, so-and-so is so much more successful than I am. And so-and-so does so much more with their time. And I suddenly feel bad when I wouldn't otherwise. And so I don't know, maybe ignorance is bliss here in some way, where if I hadn't have gotten on Twitter and I wasn't thinking about Elon Musk has 9 companies, then I wouldn't have been feeling bad about myself. I mean, it feels like the confluence of those two things have not been helpful.
Yeah, incredibly corrosive in that regard. You're a low-ranking baboon, and what does that mean? Sometime a guy who you spend all day around comes over and is mean to you. You're a poor human throughout 99% of human history, and how do you know that you are low status? You've got 2 goats and the guy next door has 3 goats or whatever. We can sit there and you're driving on the highway and somebody blasts past you in, I don't know, what's an expensive car, a Tesla or something, and you don't even see the person's face. You have this totally unprimated experience, but they make you feel subordinated and make you feel unsuccessful and make you feel like you should be anxious and looking over your shoulder or feeling helpless and hopeless. And we can sit there and read about stuff on the other side of the planet, or we can watch like a movie of like rich people and their lifestyles and feel crappy about how things turned out for you. We have ways of subordinating us here in our westernized societies like no primate has ever dreamt of before.
The thing I'm trying to figure out, maybe I'm coming back to this, like the prescription of diet and exercise, if I'm somebody, the kind of holistic lifestyle behavior change recommendations that happen if somebody's is suffering from some anxiety or some depression, if we want to stay with those examples. And I'm wondering how relevant those are, because what you're saying is the baboons they're healthy, right? Like they're in good shape. They're foraging, 3 hours a day. They're probably sleeping reasonably well. It seems there's a difference there, because you're saying, okay, the lower you are on the socioeconomic totem pole, the less healthy you are. And so I would assume you're referring to kind of like the basic markers of health, where actually the baboons, do they do reasonably on those markers and we don't? And if so, what's the difference?
Yeah, they put us to shame, but among them within the group, you see big differences. And one of the things I do with them, mostly is observing them, but I'm also able to dart baboons with a blowgun with an anesthetic. And while they're down, do a whole clinical workup on each one and see how they're. And what you see is rank is related to how much stress hormones there are in your bloodstream and what your resting blood pressure is like and how your immune system is working and how sensitive your reproductive axis is to stress. And yeah, it translates out into differences for them. And people have now been showing, colleagues at another field site in East Africa, wonderful work showing if, for example, you're a low-ranking female baboon, you have a shorter life expectancy and you have decreased total reproductive potential. And by all those rules of evolution, like you're not doing so well. This stuff plays out and it's significant for them. And it's that much more so for us if we can sit there and feel lousy by going online and seeing all the parties all over the planet you weren't invited to.
If you're making a recommendation on changes to lifestyle or behavior that are less, I'm sure you would say, hey, exercise and diet and like the basics are good. But if you were making recommendations that were specific to stress from this social status issue, because it strikes me that everybody suffers from it. Like we could bring a billionaire into the room and they're thinking about somebody who has $10 billion and they only have $1 billion, and like it never ends. Like, there's always somebody who's like better, stronger, faster, richer, whatever. And so like, how do you think about this for yourself, or what recommendations do you have for reducing stress related to the like social hierarchy?
The question there is kind of becoming, what is stressful about psychological stress? Because that billionaire is not getting stressed because they're about to be disemboweled by a predator or something. Yeah, it's all this psychological. What is it that makes the same social ambiguity around us stressful to only some of us? And a totally clear, beautiful literature shows that for the same external unpleasantry, you're more likely to subjectively feel stressed and miserable. You're more likely to turn on the stress response, and you're more at risk for stress-related disease if you feel like you have no control over what's going on, if you feel like you're getting no predictive information. When is it coming? How bad is it going to be? How long is it going to last? If you feel like you have no outlets for the frustration caused by that adversity, and if you lack social support. And you put those pieces together and they're incredibly powerful. And that also winds up explaining what it is about social and socioeconomic inequality that does this in. When you have unequal societies, the term economists use, social capital goes down. People stop trusting each other. You ask people questions like, if you needed money in an emergency, how many people could you ask for a loan? And what you see is the more inequality, the less social supportiveness and social trust along this. How many organizations do you belong to? In unequal societies, people don't belong to unions and tenant organizations and book clubs and things, because why bother? Everyone has a sense of inefficacy and such. And that's exactly a way of saying, when you have an unequal society, it translates out into people get all of the psychological stressors that are like horrible for you. And you can see this like beautiful sort of studies, whether it's a rat or a monkey or like a college freshman volunteer, sit them down and give them a shock now and then, and their blood pressure is going to go up. Give them predictive information. 10 seconds before each shock, a little warning light comes on, and you don't get the increase in blood pressure. They're getting predictive information. But give them the warning light 1 second before the shock, it doesn't do anything at all. You don't have enough time to get the psychological advantages of, oh, here it comes, and prepare myself, but no, it only lasts for a second, all of that. Now give the warning light a minute before the shock, and you make the blood pressure worse because the person is now sitting there for a minute thinking about, here comes the shock. There's these narrow domains where manipulating the psychological context in which you are feeling sort of life's adversities makes a huge difference on the health outcome. And unequal societies make it a whole lot harder to mobilize their sort of psychological defenses.
And on the individual level is the way that I push back against this. So, okay, a lack of predictability is going to increase the stress responses. And so, I mean, what I hear you making, if I read the argument I hear you making, if I read between the lines, is maybe a mindfulness argument, which is if I'm understanding myself, I'm understanding how and when and why I have spikes in anxiety or when I have depressive episodes or whatever it might be. And I create more predictability around those things. If I surround myself with people or I go out of my way to build deep and meaningful connections, that all of those things are going to mitigate the impact of the stress and anxiety in my life. Like, am I hearing you right that at the individual level, there's an argument here for mindfulness being a path to like increasing predictability?
Oh, absolutely. And also built into what you're saying, reflecting on how you work and when things go well and when things they don't. Like cognitive behavioral therapy is like a wonderful route for being able to reflect on what isn't working for you and is it like rational to have those not helpful responses in this case because it's something for real that happened in the past, but the past isn't now and it's not. And yeah, reflecting on it, or interventions like industrial psychologists or whatever. They get somebody who is stressed out of their mind because at any point in the day, the boss can show up who has no idea what's happening and will waste 20 minutes of their time babbling about something and giving advice that is completely useless. And here, at least get some control and predictability. Go into the boss's office and say, oh my God, I so value your wisdom that can we set a time every day where I could come in and sit at your feet and drink from your sagacity, however you say it. And what if you just now know, yeah, every day from 11 to 11:20, don't expect to get anything done because you're wasting your time with this. At least you've gotten some control, some predictability. So yeah, being able to analyze these situations and with a certain emotional detachment, which mindfulness can give you that sort of calm. And that's incredibly constructive for trying to figure out some interventions.
Going back to the difference between the way that the baboons live and the way that we as humans live, I'm curious for your thoughts on medications for mental health. So what do you think about, for example, like medication for ADHD? Is this only required to help bridge the gap between the requirements of our modern life and, how some people are naturally wired? Or like, do you think that there are some baboons who would benefit from some Ritalin and being medicated and that would like improve, they would forage better or whatever it might be? Like, what's your sense of the role of meds and is it purely due to that difference between the natural environment and the zoo example?
Well, first off, what's the best way to thread through a minefield like this? Psychoactive medications are unbelievably great and effective and life-saving when they're prescribed in the right circumstances. And when they're instead prescribed out of convenience because the doctor doesn't have time to really find out what's bothering you, or because the school counselor just has Ritalin handed out left and right. And yeah, it's an area with tremendous potential for abuse and the pharmaco company, military industrial complex sort of motivations for all of that's true. But nonetheless, like an unmedicated major depression is one of the most life-threatening diseases out there. And go and treat it, all of that. So having sort of like walked a narrow line there, what about baboons? Absolutely. There are absolutely baboons who are prone towards anxiety. And in addition, you see it runs in families. If you spend enough time there, you could see generations of different baboons. And yeah, they've got the same neurochemistry as us. It's the same blueprint to an amazing extent. And there's some baboons who give up more readily than others. There's some baboons who see threat that others don't. You have Like one of the things that I saw over the years, okay, here's the scenario. You take a baboon and he sits down in the middle of the day and he's sitting there grooming with someone else and just going about his business. And his worst rival on the entire planet shows up and sits down 20 yards away and takes a nap. If you're a rational baboon, what you do at that point is say, the guy's taking a nap, this is no threat to me, whatever, and you just keep what you're doing. And about a quarter of baboons instead get completely frenzied at that point. They interrupt whatever it is they were doing. They get agitated. They go break branches. They do stuff like they're seeing threats that 3/4 of the baboons don't. And they can't tell the difference between a threatening interaction and a neutral interaction. And when you look at their stress hormone levels after you control for their rank, they've got about 3 times the resting levels of stress hormones in their bloodstream as the guys who sit there and say, this is not a threat, this is not a big deal. And some baboons turn out that way. And some baboons had low-ranking mothers who trained them to expect the world to be terrible to them. And, as another example, probably lots of people who listen to your show and have dealt with anxiety at some point or other have come across benzodiazepines like Valium and Librium, minor tranquilizers that are anxiety reducers. And there's drugs that you can give experimentally that manipulate the benzodiazepine system inside our bodies. And one of my experiments was doing that with the baboons. And you see tremendous individual differences as to how much internal benzodiazepines these guys are pumping out. And some of them don't have a lot, and those are the ones who sit there and somebody sneezing in the vicinity of them makes them stop whatever they're doing and wondering if the roof's about to cave in on them. You get the exact same range of individual differences arising from very similar sort of, what was your childhood like? Did you learn the world as a safe place or a threatening place? And some of the same genes are involved as well as in humans.
So there's the environmental piece, and then there's the genetic piece, which is, hey, just some baboons are wired a little bit differently. Some take it easy when the rival is close by. Some freak out when the rival is close by. And this is a case when prescribed properly, et cetera, where the medication can help bridge some of that gap. Before we transition to free will, because I want to make sure we get there, in your work on behavior, what have we learned about like when and why in the context of primate, or in the context of humans or baboons, behavior changes, and specifically it changes for some positive reason. I think there's a whole host of reasons we could talk about where behavior changes and it goes in the negative direction. But what do we know about how, when, why behavior changes in a way that improves quality of life?
Well, maybe this is a segue into talking about what I mostly think about these days, which is that we've got no free will. We're just biological machines. When you look at the underpinnings of biology and its interaction with environments, that's who we are. We are nothing more or less than those biological environmental circumstances that we had no control over that made us who we are today. So people immediately have apoplexy over that because people are very, very uncomfortable with the notion that we don't have any agency. And one of the things they get freaked out about is exactly what you brought up. Oh my God, if you're saying there's no free will, nothing can ever change. And what's obvious is people change unrecognizably, societies changes. But the key thing to recognize when looking at the sort of change that could underline changing your diet so that you become more healthy, recognizing sleep patterns are contributing to your mood problems, whatever, you do not sit there and change. You do not sit there and decide to change. What happens is circumstances change you. And the sort of person you've become influences what circumstances you put yourself into and influences what your response will be. Okay, an example, you sit down 2 people and you show them a film talking about how much lack of exercise is bad for your health and bad for your mental health and all that sort of stuff. And one person comes out changed by the experience. They come out and say, wow, that really opened my eyes. And tomorrow, first thing, I'm going to start exercising. And the second person comes out changed by the experience. And they come out and say, oh my God, I can't believe how cheesy the script was and how bad the lighting was on that. First thing tomorrow, I'm going to find out who the cinematographer was and make sure I never look at anything that they've done again. Whoa, your behavior was changed by that experience, but in completely different ways, because almost certainly those two people went into that situation having been sculpted into being different sorts of people. So that one person comes out saying, I'm going to change my diet for the better. And the other is worrying about like how terrible the music was in the background. And once that person decides starting tomorrow, I'm going to eat better and exercise and some of that, it's going to be a whole world then of some of the ones who say that are going to. And some of the ones who don't, who say that and don't do it, have a different biology of self-discipline and gratification postponement, and they got to be the way they are by the circumstances that came before, just as surely as anything else. So we cannot choose to change, but hopefully, say, if you're listening to something like this, you are already the sort of person who will seek out information about stuff like this by listening to this. You are already the sort of person who has the luxury to be able to be doing that right now instead of working 3 shifts a day or whatever. You have the cognitive capacity to reflect on what you're hearing and decide how it applies to you. And you're one of the lucky ones that you turned out to be somebody who could be changed in that way. And somebody else could be listening to this and said, damn, I thought this station was just playing Taylor Swift or something. And you get irritated and turn it off because you've turned into a different sort of person. You have been turned into a different sort of person. And what we see here is, how do people change in healthier ways along the lines we've been talking about? Listening to something like this, going and reading up on something as a result, talking to a friend who seems to be having success with it, and actually listen to getting insights from experience as to when you follow through with your self-disciplined resolutions and when you fail completely. We can be changed by circumstance. And once we understand what sort of circumstances change us in what ways, we can choose, we can be more likely to wind up in beneficial settings than unbeneficial ones.
Where I struggle with the argument that there is no free will, because I believe you. I like the book is compelling, and you've spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have. And so I think I accept the premise that there isn't free will. And I understand the logic of, I didn't decide who my parents were, and they were born into a certain culture that shaped them and their parents, and all the way down the line, like back to the Big Bang. There's some nearly infinite number of little variables that have conspired to make me. And so intellectually I understand that argument. Where I struggle with it is, so much, I spend all of my time thinking about, how do I change my behavior? Like, how do I do things that help me be healthy and happy? And how do I help other people do the same thing? I just spend all of my time thinking about that. And so much of that comes down to like just the little talk tracks in our head. And it's really hard for me to let go of there like not being free will in the little talk track that can kind of push me one way or another. So I want to just quickly read a little excerpt because somebody else said this better than I did, and I just want to get your response to it. So in David Foster Wallace's 2005, he did a speech called "This Is Water" at Kenyon College. He says, learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. And later in the speech, he uses an example of standing in line in a grocery store, and he says, but most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of a husband who is dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicle department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it is also not impossible. It just depends on what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure you know what reality is and you're operating on your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to pay attention, then you will know there are options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars, love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. I really love that. And I really love believing that in these moments I'm in line at the store, I have some choice as to how to frame that and how to think about that. And so how do we think about that in the context of no free will?
Well, first off, that's an amazing quote. And you just need to tinker with it a little bit for that to be completely compatible with like an absence of free will. He's saying, try to be the sort of person where you're standing in line, totally frustrated there and feeling contemptuous of that person, and think instead about their circumstances and realize, it's not by chance they became that way. And they may have had fortune much worse than yours. Okay, the key difference is saying, okay, choose to become the sort of person who does that. And what you have to have is instead the history of biological and environmental luck, so that you've become the sort of person that when you find out there's people who are like sitting at home caring for their spouse dying of bone cancer, and that's amazing. And if you have turned out to be the sort of person who's able to extrapolate from that and say, well, look at that. Maybe that's their situation, or maybe they just have stuff going on that I could never even imagine because I've been lucky or whatever. And as a result, circumstances have made you less judgmental, or you're less likely to yell at them, come on, lady, or whatever it is, rather than you choosing to become more empathic, whatever. You've lucked out so that you're the sort of person who can derive lessons from life around you and turn that into changes in your own behavior in this particular direction.
How has it changed like your internal talk track? I asked you to come on the podcast a couple of years ago and you responded, I'm in the middle of book writing. It's going horribly and I'm having to say no to everything else these days. So I would assume, writing a book is a hard thing. You finish the book, that you're waking up and there's some talk track to try to convince yourself to put some words on the page and to get the book done. And if you're succeeding in that talk track, then you're getting more done in a particular day. And if you're losing in that talk track, then you're getting less done. And so what's happening in your mind? Because you don't believe in free will. Like, how do you think that's different? Because my talk track would be like, I can do this. And like, I just got to make the choice to like carve out the time, not be distracted. And I would be assuming some autonomy of action. I think I would be assuming free will in order to like convince myself to make progress on the thing that's been hard to make progress on. So what is happening in your head? Because we still got to get up every day and like try to, write our book or whatever that is for each of us. And so what is that for you?
Yeah. And in some ways that could lead to a why bother conclusion. I mean, no free will. Oh my God, what are we going to do with criminals? And what are we going to do with people running amok? But at the heart of everybody's discomfort is if we're just biological machines, why bother? And you deal with this bizarrity about us as a species, which is, we're biological machines, just the way like crayfish are, or redwood trees or whatever. We're biological machines, but we're biological machines that can know our machineness and behave accordingly and evaluate things accordingly. And you get this totally bizarre situation with a human where you can sit there and say, as I do, oh my God, I love my wife. She's like the greatest person in the world. And be able to say, how did I become the sort of person who would feel this way? Well, we know something about vasopressin receptors in reward parts of the brain. And there's something about this gene and no doubt olfactory receptors in my nose and pheromonal sensitive. And what does it mean that could be broken down to that in some ways? Does that rob one of that? Or what does it mean that you can sit and watch some gazelle leap 20 feet in the air and know that if you learned enough biomechanics, you could turn that into an equation for how in hell that thing could jump, that sort of thing, and the angles on its pelvis or God knows what. And what we see is one does not rule out the other. What we do with our knowledge of our biological machineness is recognizing that machines that we are, nonetheless, pain is painful. And it's good if there's less of it. And it's good if you act to decrease the amounts of it for other people. Feeling a sense of being loved and safety is a good thing. And thus one should strive for more of that. And then you hit that same wall again, because it seems totally ridiculous, the notion that something good or bad can happen to a machine. But nonetheless, it's a good thing when these machines feel less pain and feel more safety and happiness in life. There's this weird simultaneity that we have to maintain to get up in the morning. But what we have to do is to become the sort of people where we don't just go on the superficial level when we're trying to make sense of that woman standing in front of us in the supermarket line, and there's the temptation to judge and assume there was free will going on in there that made her who she is.
It's been interesting in reading the book. There've been a couple reactions that I've had. One is there's a little bit of a sigh of relief. I think it's easier to have self-compassion after taking in the book and the argument, where there's a little bit more hey, it's okay. You can't really control the way that you are, and you've got your strengths and you've got your weaknesses, and that's all right. That's the culmination of a billion years of different events that have brought you here, and you can rest easy in who you are. It's not your fault. It reminds me of maybe the Good Will Hunting line. He's telling Will Hunting, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And I feel there's a sigh of relief in that. I think on the flip side, maybe where I struggle, and I'm hoping you can help me, is in the utility. And I'm wondering if maybe there's some utility in deluding ourselves and telling ourselves that there is free will. So I'll give you again these kind of micro examples. I really like to have a couple of beers between 5 and 7, and they're not good for me. They hurt my sleep, and they affect my well-being negatively. But I've got a really strong craving between 5 and 7. And as it gets closer to 5 each day, I'm in a little bit of a decision battle. I can drink the non-alcoholic beer or do the workout, or I can make a set of decisions that get me through that period, and then I sleep better and things are better. Or I make the decision to have the beer, and then it's and then I end up regretting it. I go down a path where I sleep poorly or whatever it might be. I find myself when I'm convinced of no free will, it's easier for me to let myself off the hook for going down the path that I know is not the path that I want to go down. And so what's your advice, or how do you think about those small moments of decision and reconciling that with lack of free will?
Those small moments are where people cling to a notion of free will most strongly, because you've just picked vanilla over chocolate, and it feels so in the moment and so intentional and so unbreakably glued to your sense of me-ness, that there's a me inside there that's separate of all this neuron stuff, that it seems inconceivable that there was free will that went on. And all you have to do to get some insight into where the lack of free will comes in is saying, where'd that intent come from? How did you become the sort of person who would choose vanilla over ice cream? Because of genes and environment and biology and all that sort of thing. So you look at sort of your circumstance there, and okay, you've lucked out that you turned out, for whatever circumstances, to be the sort of person who's capable of self-reflecting. And thus you could even make a statement like, I know it's not good for me, and there's something wrong about the fact that I keep giving in, and it's every day between 5 and 7. And because you're the sort of reflective person, you may also then be able to reflect on the fact that you have a respect for medical findings. And you're the sort of person where you need to have a big, glossy, repulsive poster up over your refrigerator of what a sclerotic liver looks like. And maybe that's the thing that you need. Or maybe with your capacity that you turned out to be able to reflect and getting the insight that what works for you is don't be anywhere near a bottle of beer between 5 and 7 each day. Or that's a good time to take a nap. And it's not by chance that you turned out to be the sort of person who could even make that reflective statement and have the capability of assessing what sort of person you are and what sort of things work for you in the past to be able to then repeat those experiences.
And so final question is, I think you're in the minority in terms of, I think most people believe there is free will. My guess is that you're more right than most people. You've been very thoughtful about it, and the argument is really strong. If we were to wave a magic wand and flip it, that everybody signs up for, the Sapolsky view of free will, what changes? Like, how does that change things? Are we in a better world? Are we in the same world? Are we in a worse world? I guess maybe it seems like it changes something. I mean, what happens if we wave that magic wand and change that?
I think it would become a so much better world. Because if you really follow through the implications of all of this, blaming someone and punishment makes no sense whatsoever and is, in fact, a moral bad. Praising someone and rewarding somebody makes no sense either. And thus, the criminal justice system has to be trashed. Meritocracies have to be trashed as well, because the reality is none of us have earned to have our needs and considerations treated any differently than anybody else's. And what you also get out of that is it makes no sense to hate anyone, because that makes as little sense as hating an earthquake or hating a virus that's good at getting into your lungs. And just when you sit there and say, okay, this is totally asinine, and like, yeah, right, we're supposed to get to that state of mind, the one comforting thing is we've done it over and over and over again in the past. For example, we have learned that old ladies with no teeth living in huts on the edge of the village don't control the weather with their witchcraft. And thus, it doesn't make sense to burn them at the stake. And it's a much better world that we don't burn old ladies when the weather turns bad. And we learned that schizophrenia is caused by a neurogenetic bad luck. And it's not due to mothers being hateful, Freudianly toxic mothers. And thousands of mothers found out it's not their fault that they're... And it's a more humane world when people learn that, like, say, a variant of a gene coding for a receptor for a hormone called leptin, if you've got one version of that gene, there's not a damn thing you could do in terms of showing self-discipline. You are going to be obese, as has every family member with that gene variant. And maybe the world will stop telling you that you lack self-discipline and are self-indulgent and no doubt hate yourself unconsciously. And that's why, and you just got crappy biological luck. And every time we've done that in the past, not only hasn't the roof fallen in because we subtracted responsibility out of the picture, it's become a nicer place to live in. We've been nicer to people.
I like that. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for your time. It's been wonderful.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on. This has been fun.
The Most Days Show is recorded in Boulder, Colorado, produced by Patrick Adino, music by Patrick Lee, and hosted by yours truly, Brent Franson, founder and CEO of Most Days.